Okay, looks like we are recording. So once again, good morning. Welcome to Class 5 in the Art of Self-Coaching on Happiness. I'm Ed Batista, and I'm really happy to be back here with you again. Once again, same as last week, there's some construction going on in my neighborhood in San Francisco. So you may hear some construction vehicles because they are repaving a big street just outside my window. There's very little, in fact, there's nothing that I can do about that. Hopefully it's not too distracting and it won't make it difficult for us to proceed with today's class, and we'll just manage as we are all doing in lots of ways these days. So this is Class 5. Our topic is happiness. Let me just remind you of some best practices for Zoom in this setting. Use the Q&A function to submit your questions during my remarks. What I'm finding is that if questions will certainly come up while I'm making some remarks, please share them. Then while I have you get into a coaching conversation with your partner, I'll compile those questions and respond to them in a segment after the coaching conversation. That'll allow me to touch on particular themes in your questions. I've noted in the past that Zoom's side-by-side mode is probably going to allow you to get the optimal layout to allow you to kind of find the right balance between my slides, which tend to have relatively little text, and the video. If you have any suggestions, not only on the logistics, but also on the course content, please email me at this address here. I may not be able to respond to you, but I promise I will read everything, and I've already had a number of great suggestions that I think have helped me make this a more effective course. A reminder around partner conversations. You've got to have somebody you can interact with in real time during class, and that can be in person if you're sheltering in place with somebody, or just pick up the phone or have a separate video channel available. I do want you to, I'm not going to talk further about coaching methodology or coaching practices, although there are links in the on my website in the course archive under the first class for additional resources to help remind you of coaching practices. And I'd like you to experiment with the coaching process. So these aren't simply conversations that you might have over a cup of coffee or a beer. During those conversations, I'll have an on-screen timer to help you keep on track. And it'll be important to do that because I'll be bringing everybody back for some further remarks to ensure that we stay on time. Here's our agenda. To help you manage your energy over the course of the next hour and a half. I'm going to open with a few remarks on happiness and well-being. Then I'm going to have you get into the first coaching conversation with your partner, and we will debrief it. I'll be responding to the questions that you submitted. Then I have some further remarks on character strengths and meaning. And then I'll have a second coaching conversation and another debrief and then we'll wrap up with a few comments for next time. Here we go. I've asked you to prepare for a warm-up, and today's warm-up, in keeping with the theme of happiness, was to prepare a joke to tell to your partner. That was something I teed up in this week's announcement. And of course, since I'm asking you to do something a little awkward, it really only seems fair that I put a little skin in the game here myself. So my brother owns a bar, so I love jokes that are in the format of a guy walks into a bar, and two guys walk into a bar. The third guy ducks. Sure. It's really hard telling jokes online when I have no idea how they land. So I'll keep going. A sandwich walks into a bar and orders a beer. And the bartender says, "I'm sorry, we don't serve food here." All right, last effort. A horse walks into a bar and the bartender says, "Why the long face?" All right, that's terrible, I know. But I want you to take a minute and tell a joke to your partner, and then get the joke from your partner, and I will be back in 2 minutes. All right, welcome back. I hope you exchanged. I've had a humorous exchange with your partner. Um, a theme in this class, and really one of the sort of most significant bodies of thought that we're drawing on across the course of all 9 sessions, not merely in today's session, is positive psychology, and a dilemma that we encounter is that positive psychology can often be stereotyped as sort of happiness studies. You know, the idea that it's really about rainbows and, you know, puppies and ice cream cones. And that can make it seem very sort of superficial and unsubstantial. And that's not really what the positive psychologists were aiming at. The positive psychology movement, I mean, really the leading figure is this eminent psychologist, a man named Martin Seligman, whose thought about this really dates back to the 80s and then began to pick up steam in the 90s. And he recognized that we as a culture and psychology as a profession had increasing clarity on what constitutes mental illness, and in some cases what to do about it, and how to even heal some forms of mental illness, how to provide meaningful and sustainable cures. And yet we have relatively little understanding of what constitutes well-being. And that got it got discussed as happiness. And so positive psychology as a movement got, you know, characterized and sometimes caricatured as happiness studies. And that's really not what they were aiming at. What they were aiming at, the best word to describe what they were aiming at, was from the ancient Greek, eudaimonia, which can best be translated as the highest human aim, or could, you know, alternatively be translated as flourishing or fulfillment. And it's really important to distinguish eudaimonia and eudaimonic well-being from hedonic well-being, from mere pleasure. We see a clue to this in the work of Aristotle. The Nicomachean Ethics was really one of the most important texts in the positive psychology movement, among the founders and leading figures in this movement. And he tells us happiness does not lie in amusement, but in virtuous activities. So important just to put that frame on our conversation today about happiness, that we're not just talking about pleasure or amusement. In some sense, we're talking about deeper, more meaningful, more fulfilling pursuits and approaches to well-being. So it begs the question, you know, should this class have been called eudaimonia? You know, I think this is a little confusing because it's obviously not a word that we encounter in common speech. It's not really well known or well understood. Should it have been called flourishing? Well, that's what Martin Seligman called his last book, which didn't sell that well, and I think, you know, confused people a little bit. And so I've chosen to just continue to call it happiness and wrestle with the challenge that we encounter in using this term in the English language, because it often suggests a kind of insubstantial, more superficial approach to well-being. But it also serves as a useful bookend to the class that we'll encounter in 2 weeks on unhappiness, which introduces its own dilemmas, at least in the English language. Now, caveat around the research that I've asked you to explore and that we'll talk about a little bit further in today's class. It's easily misunderstood, and one of my most important goals in this class is to clear up some of those misunderstandings, to deconstruct some of the myths that attach to the happiness research. The data, I think, is robust, and yet it continues to evolve. This is very much an area where we're not dealing with settled science. You know, a theme in this class that I've touched on before is that there are no algorithms to human behavior. There are a bunch of heuristics, a bunch of guidelines that can help us better understand how we tend to react, how others tend to react in certain circumstances. And yet we really need to continue to actively experiment. We can't expect what we're learning about human behavior to feel like the laws of physics. And yet we can take these preliminary findings and begin to experiment. So my goal for us is to be able to take this data, to take these conclusions from this research and put it to work, put it to practice by experimenting actively with it in our lives. You know, again, a theme in this course is it's not useful if it's merely conceptual. If you're, hopefully I'm presenting ideas in ways that allow you to broaden your understanding, and yet that's not sufficient. The purpose of this course is actually to take these ideas and put them into practice and see what works for you as an individual. And that's very, very true with today's material. So one thing that we can conclude, one thing we know about happiness, about well-being, is that it matters. Higher levels of subjective well-being are associated with a bunch of positive life outcomes. Happier people tend to live longer. Happier people tend to earn more, with some caveats. Happier, which I'll talk about. Happier people tend to get sick less often. And when they do, they tend to recover more quickly. Now, you're surely aware that correlation is not causation. When we don't understand fully how the arrow of causation runs, in this context, do people live longer because they're happier, or do people who are happier tend to live longer? Do people earn more because they're happier? Are they better at their jobs because they're prone towards higher levels of well-being? Or are people who are better at their jobs prone to higher levels of well-being? We don't entirely know. And yet again, I think the data is robust enough to allow us to begin to take it and actively experiment it. And it's also important to bear in mind that more isn't always better. The goal is not simply, it may not be, to increase levels of subjective well-being. If you read the optional reading by Ed Diener, really eminent psychologist, in which he talks about some of the complexities of this research and some of the problems with the way it is often presented, he also talks specifically about the very complex relationship between wealth and happiness, and notes that the very highest earners tend to be a little less happy than the people who earn a little bit less. There is, to be very clear, a very strong positive correlation between higher levels of material wealth and happiness. That's another problem with the way this research is often presented, is that it's suggested as if that relationship doesn't exist. And although we could say money doesn't equal happiness, that's a truism, there's certainly a clear relationship. And yet, if your goal is to be, to earn as much as possible, then you may actually be sacrificing a degree of well-being in the process. Although, of course, how the arrow of causation in that process is not clearly understood. This begs the question then of, what can we do to influence our subjective level of well-being? What steps can we take to be happier? And one way of thinking of it is, well, can we actively pursue it? The pursuit of happiness, of course, is an important theme, at least in the history of the U.S. Or must happiness ensue? Must it be derived from the life that we're living, and must it emerge from other choices that we're making? Viktor Frankl, the great Austrian psychiatrist and philosopher, whose work we will encounter in 2 weeks in our class on happiness. He had a very, very strong point of view of this. He said happiness must happen. From Frankl's perspective, the pursuit of happiness renders it all the more elusive, and that's a legitimate point of view. Can't say he's wrong, and yet one of the findings from positive psychology that really underpins today's class, and I think is worth considering quite seriously, Seligman and his colleagues in that movement saw this association between higher levels of subjective well-being and these components. There's a genetic set point. There's a degree to which our genetic inheritance tends to influence our level of happiness. Life circumstances play a role, as do intentional activities. And happiness seems to be the output of these various factors. And that leads us to this chart, the pie chart, as it's referred to in this context. And that leads to the warning that I provided last time. I said, look, beware about how this data is presented, because it's often poorly misunderstood. So I want to talk a little bit about facts and myths, some things that we can state as facts drawing upon this research, and some myths that tend to attach to it. First, it's a fact that what these figures represent are the variance among individuals in the sample. The various factors here, when we assess a sample of people in this research, these various factors tend to predict the level of happiness across the body of individuals in the sample, to the extent associated with these figures. And yet it's a myth that it says anything about the source of each individual's happiness. So to be really, really clear, this data cannot tell you anything about where you derive from what you derive happiness. It's impossible. That's not what it's trying to tell you. It is a fact that our genes influence our happiness, and yet it's a myth that your genes are, comprise 50% of your happiness. It's impossible for that data to say anything. So it's important to bear in mind, in some cases, we may be influenced by genetic heritage, and we may, just as our genetic heritage influences other aspects of our life experience, our fitness, our weight, our overall health. We may need to work to address, to either take advantage of or counteract our genetic inheritance, but it's not the case that this research can tell you that 50% of your happiness is derived from your genetic heritage. It's a fact that life circumstances matter less than we think. And I assert that on the basis that, the popular narratives about the sources of happiness tend to give a lot of weight to life circumstances, how much you earn, where you live, whether or not you're in a successful relationship, etc. And we tend to believe that our life circumstances are going to have by far the biggest impact on our happiness. And again, the research shows that across bodies of individuals, across a group, that tends to be not true. It tends to have less of an impact. It's a myth, though. It's a myth that your life circumstances are 10% of your happiness. Now, this research has been done, sufficiently across large and sufficiently heterogeneous bodies of people to make clear. Again, life circumstances matter less than we think relative to the popular narratives that suggest how significant they are. But if the sample were comprised of people from, depending on the composition of the sample, life circumstances might matter much more. And certainly life circumstances might matter a great deal for you. So it's important for you to be very thoughtful about what are the life circumstances that are going to contribute to my happiness, and how do I subjectively assess that? Here's another fact. Hedonic adaptation diminishes impact. This is one reason why life circumstances tend to matter relatively less. When we enjoy a boost in our life circumstances, we land a new job, or we get a promotion in our existing job, or something good happens, we feel good as a result. And yet, one of the features of human psychology that we often experience as a bug as individuals, which of course is a theme in this class, is that we're extremely adaptable. That has very good, there are very good dimensions to this. When we experience a negative life event, we tend to adapt to it over a period of time. And we can draw that conclusion from all sorts of research about people who've suffered personal or physiological setbacks. And yet the same is true with positive life events. The boost that we enjoy from a positive life event tends not to last. And again, you can think of that as a feature for the species. It keeps us driving forward, but we often experience it as a bug. It leaves us feeling disenchanted, or at least less satisfied or fulfilled than we expected to be as a result of a positive life event. And yet it's a myth that circumstances don't matter. I wouldn't want any of you to walk away from this research with the conclusion that life circumstances are relevant, because that's not what the research tells us. It's a fact that money does not equal happiness. I mean, it's a truism that we've learned from many sources in life, from many philosophical and spiritual traditions. But it's a myth that it's irrelevant. Again, if you didn't read the optional piece by Ed Diener, I refer you back to it, where he talks about the vast complexity in the relationship between material wealth and subjective well-being. And yet he emphasizes there is a very clear and strong positive correlation. Now, there's also an inflection point in that curve. It's pretty clear that above a certain point, additional units of wealth do not yield the same sort of units of happiness. And that's also very subjective. It differs for each of us as individuals. It can differ significantly based on our context. So it's important to bear in mind, again, while you're very unlikely to derive sustainable fulfillment and well-being merely from material wealth, simply because of the inevitability of hedonic adaptation. It's also important not to conclude from this research that it is irrelevant. Let me just reverse the order here. A myth that some people might draw from this research and from the way this material is presented is that intentional activities are 40% of happiness, or that 40% of my happiness is going to be derived from intentional activities. Not true. But a fact is that they can have a significant impact. And this is one of the most, I think, important findings from positive psychology, that these small scale, intentional, daily or consistent activities can have a surprisingly large impact on our happiness. Why does this matter so much? Why is this so important? Well, let me refer you back to our class on change, where I said, hey, if we're trying to pursue a large, complex goal, such as positively influencing our sense of well-being, it's going to be very hard to get your arms around that. It's going to be much easier if you can break a goal down into some specific activities. And hopefully those activities allow you to start small with practices that you can fit into your daily or weekly schedule. It allows you to cultivate some routines, so you don't have to think as explicitly, am I going to do this today? It just simply becomes a little bit more automatic because it's built into your schedule. And you get to celebrate some small wins along the way. all of that is eminently possible when we consider the happiness strategies that Sonia Lyubomirsky talks about. It's a lot harder, though, if we just think about happiness in the abstract. Here's where Lyubomirsky's work is really useful because she's done some extensive study on the activities that have a demonstrable impact that can be broken out and separated as having an impact on reported levels of well-being. Here are those activities as you explored in the activity fit diagnostic. Now, I'm not going to talk through all of them here because you had a chance to explore them further, and I refer you to Lyubomirsky's work where she talks about them in greater detail. I do want to take a minute to just talk a little bit first about engaging in activities that promote a greater sense of engagement, or flow experiences as they're often called. This concept derives from the work of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the Hungarian-American psychologist down at Claremont in Southern California. And here's one way to sort of understand this concept. If we were to map our challenge that we're facing against our skill level in that challenge, when the challenge is too high, we experience anxiety. We're nervous. We feel we're not going to accomplish our goals. When the challenge is too low relative to our skill level, we get bored. We're not really sufficiently engaged. And yet, when they're matched, when the challenge we're facing is appropriately matched, fitted, and well suited to our skill level, we experience flow. So important to kind of just have an understanding of what that means, even though what determines a flow experience for us is radically different. Some people experience it while working on a spreadsheet. Some people experience it while coding. Some people experience it while reading complex academic papers. Some people experience it while video gaming, etc. It's like you've got to find the activity that really suits your personal needs. But this is a useful framework to bear in mind and ask yourself what experiences might evoke a sense of flow for me. I also want to say a little bit about what Lyubomirsky calls taking care of your body in the context of this diagnostic, because when we unpack that a little bit further, we see that she's grouped together these three quite different activities, meditation, exercise and rest, smiling and laughing. And those actually are, I mean, certainly there's a physiological dimension to them, so we could understand why they might all be looped together. But my theory here is that a dozen happiness strategies sounds a little bit better than 14. 14 is kind of an odd number in our culture, whereas a dozen feels a little bit normal. So you might want to treat them as distinct strategies, even if the assessment told you that taking care of your body was a strategy that might be useful for you. So with that, and with this list of strategies as some context, I want to remind you, there's no optimal mix. What's going to be most useful for you is highly personalized, and it's contingent on these factors. Does it feel natural? Am I kind of swimming with my personal tides? Do I enjoy it? And is it aligned with my values? Now, these are subtle distinctions, but in employing these different lenses, Lyubomirsky is trying to help us understand what are the strategies that might sort of bubble up and be most relevant to me. And it's important to note the absence of guilt or pressure is key in making some choices as to where I want to invest my time. Now, what I often hear from people who are exploring this research is, wait a second, in a lot of contexts, guilt is actually, I'm either being induced to engage in some activities as a result of guilt, maybe in my in various aspects of life, guilt is kind of a lever to get me to do something. And so why would guilt be excluded here? Well, guilt tends to work when we're being policed. Whether we're in some kind of system or we're under the eye of an authority figure, we may pursue an activity we're a little reluctant to because we feel guilty that we're not doing it. And when in the absence of being policed, if we're simply doing it sort of on our own, for our own benefit, guilt might get it started, but it rarely turns it into a sustainable activity. That's absolutely what Lyubomirsky's work shows. So that's why we want to segregate out experiences that are in which we're motivated to pursue as a result of guilt. So here's a conversation. I want to get you into the first coaching conversation with your partner. in part 2 of the class prep that I teed up in this week's announcement, I asked you to think about what happiness strategies most interest you. And I'd like your diagnostic to inform that choice. It doesn't have to dictate it. And I want you to think about what experiments you might run, because again, this is useful only to the extent that you are actively experimenting with these ideas. It's not useful on a purely conceptual basis. So you're gonna have 8 minutes per person. A coaches B for 8 minutes, B coaches A for 8 minutes. I'd like you to ask these questions and explore this with yourself. I'll see you back here in 16 minutes. All right, welcome back. Your 16 minutes are up, and I hope you had a fruitful conversation with your partner while recognizing you're still grappling with a lot of questions related to this material. And let me take a few minutes and address that. I'm going to briefly stop sharing the slides, and hopefully I will remember to restart the slides after I take a few minutes to answer these questions. First, a question about the relationship between happiness and wealth above a specific dollar figure. Yeah, there's been a lot of research that suggests there is an inflection point above a certain amount, and in some cases, the studies, the figure of $75,000 a year is thrown around. My reading is that it's important to bear in mind the subjectivity of all of this research. I'm not aware of anything that definitively states, hey, there is some universal dollar figure that applies to people across the board, and above that dollar amount, you're going to enjoy less happiness as a result. This is where I think it's very important to bear in mind the subjective nature of this research. The general principle that there is an inflection point in that research is important to bear in mind, because simply aiming to sort of maximize income is unlikely to have an ever upward relationship with subjective well-being. And there is a relationship between material wealth and well-being. So it's important to bear in mind that this research is not telling us that it doesn't matter. It's telling us to question the extent to which it does matter, because in many cases, again, the popular narratives about the sources of well-being in our lives, particularly the impact of material well-being, often give those factors a much heavier weight. So a question about hey, how should this pie chart be applied if I'm telling you how not to apply it? Well, I think overall guidelines, recognizing there may be a genetic component to your source of happiness. And again, we can't apply that universally. We can't say, 50% of my happiness is derived from my genetic inheritance. And just bearing in mind, if that is the case for me, just as I would have to address, if my genetic inheritance leaves me more prone to be less healthy in some ways, if my genetic inheritance leaves me to be more prone to be less happy, can I take a more proactive stance to addressing the other factors that are within my control, given that my genes are not? And here, again, life circumstances may matter, but life circumstances, the large-scale life circumstances that we're talking about here, are harder to influence. The small-scale intentional activities are much easier to influence. So while life circumstances may loom large in your personal and subjective definition of happiness, and the sources of happiness may, for you as an individual, may rest heavily on life circumstances, those are harder to change. What's easier to change are the small-scale intentional activities. So experimenting with the results of your diagnostic could be a very effective lever, particularly if your genetic inheritance leaves you prone to being less happy. Questions about variance, like what exactly does it mean? There are some optional readings that I really encourage you to dig into. One reason why this research is poorly understood is because it's so easy to not fully grasp the concept of variance. One way to think about it is we're assessing the extent to which a variable in a given equation predicts the outcome. If we were to think about height, our height is by and large a factor of our genes. And let's say our early childhood nutrition. And in most cases where people are growing up in a set of circumstances where they're well fed as kids, the genes are 90-95% of the sort of the genotype predicts a person's height with let's say to 90 or 95%. Now, does that mean that 90 or 95% of your height is a function of your genes, or that you could say that that's where your height derives from? Not really. What portion of your height comes from your genes? No, we're simply saying that across a sample of people, the expected variance in the outcome can be tied back to an original variable. And it's also important to bear in mind that number is going to change dramatically with regard to the heterogeneity of a sample. If you had a sample in which some people, or a much larger than expected number of people, had very poor nutrition as children, then that number is going to be much higher in the outcome. And the results of the pie chart, have been applied. The pie chart research has been applied across sufficiently, heterogeneous groups that we can we can have some comfort and some faith that those those numbers are broadly accurate, but again, they can't tell you anything about your experience as an individual. Question about flow activities. How do I assess, productive ones and unproductive ones? And there, I think, again, it's an extremely subjective definition. What is productive? What is not? Or if something is, quote, unproductive, how much of it is okay? I actually would refer you back to our class on attention, and understand that a lot of, unproductive, the question was posed, about video games. Video games are obviously designed to capture our attention and draw us in. And for a lot of people, they can be an extremely useful way of relaxing, of kind of unplugging, of not thinking about other sources of anxiety or concern. And yet, because they are designed to kind of engage us and draw us in, is there a point at which this sort of rewarding, engaging activity becomes unproductive? Sure, absolutely. And it's important for us to then subjectively determine how much is enough. And our class on attention talked about a number of factors that allows you to sort of get a sense of, hey, if my attention is being drawn into an undesired object of focus, how can I manage that? And a starting point is simply, can I pay attention to where my attention is being directed? A question about how to discover such activities. And here's where active experimentation is really key. And also just getting a sense of, what am I being drawn into? And going back to our class on attention, is my attention being drawn into something that's useful for me, or is it being captured and hijacked in some way by a system that's designed to sort of harvest and ultimately monetize my attention? Lastly, a question on weaknesses. Why the emphasis on focusing on strengths? And that's actually going to be a theme in this class. We'll talk about it in the second half of this session. We'll talk about it later in our upcoming class on success. And let me just put that in context. If we go back to one of the sort of foundational ideas in this course, the idea of a growth mindset and the capability for change. Absolutely, we are capable of change well into the end stages of our lives, even at my advanced age. I remain neuroplastic and am capable of change. And the question is, what's the opportunity cost? If I'm investing in addressing an area where I am, somewhat weaker, I may actually I may have to spend more effort on, achieving excellence than I would if I pursue an area where I'm already strong. Also, specifically with regard to Liebowitz-Mirsky's research, if an activity is not aligned with your values, if it doesn't feel natural, if you don't enjoy it intrinsically, you're unlikely to stick with it. You might get, initially, going, and it's not going to become a sustainable activity for you. Lastly, actually, a question was posed: why do I wear 2 watches? And is it related to happiness? And actually, it is. I experiment with a bunch of sort of data capturing devices. And not because I'm some, quantified self nut, but I find it useful to sort of track various types of data. These help me measure sleep and physical activity, daily exercise, and then mapping that across my sense of subjective well-being, and doing this both for my own purposes, but also as a way of helping understand how I might talk about any of this with clients. All right, I want to push on here. I see some additional questions, which I will dig into when I get you into your next coaching conversation and hopefully be able to respond to them further. But let me go back and share the screen and push on into the second half of class. So I want to take a few minutes and talk about meaning and purpose. Martin Seligman, key leading figure in the positive psychology movement, tells us, hey, this is a definition of the pleasant life, the successful pursuit of positive feelings. And yet that's somehow, it leaves out the opportunity of being more deliberate. And here's where he talks about, opportunities to pursue it more deliberately and enjoy more as a result. The good life is a life wrapped up in using your signature strengths to obtain abundant and authentic gratification. And that's really what we're talking about trying to accomplish today. Not merely a pleasant life, not really a life in which I'm, enjoying some, I'm amusing myself and enjoying some positive feelings, but I am more deliberately and intentionally using signature strengths to obtain authentic gratification, essentially the pursuit of eudaimonia. Seligman goes a step further and talks about the importance of meaning. And here he's asserting by being connected to something, by serving something larger than ourselves, we're likely to enjoy a greater sense of meaning. And I think that's also very consistent with work that's derived from a significant study. It was also touched on in the questions, the long running, at this point, I think 80 years running Harvard Adult Development Study, which shows that people who've invested in meaningful work and meaningful relationships enjoy a much higher degree of life satisfaction and fulfillment. It's also very consistent with the work I asked you to explore this week by Emily Esfahani Smith, who talks about the fact that enjoying a sense of meaning in the absence of happiness can still allow us to feel fulfillment, even if we're going through periods of unhappiness. And conversely, feeling a sense of superficial pleasure, but in the absence of meaning, can actually have negative health impacts. So why does this matter? Why emphasize meaning and purpose? And why is this at the heart of the work of some of the pioneering positive psychologists? Well, again, meaning is more important than pleasure. It can have a much greater impact on our sense of well-being, and pleasure is, in the absence of meaning, superficial pleasure is insufficient and often leaves us actually feeling feeling and being less healthy. Of course, bear in mind that positive psychology is not merely about the pursuit of amusement. It's not about pleasure. This idea that it's it can be caricatured as the sort of study of rainbows and ice cream cones doesn't do justice to what they're really asking us to do, is understand paths to eudaimonia. So that brings us to this work on character strengths. And here, Martin Seligman, he actually recruited Chris Peterson, who at the time was teaching at Michigan, to join him and a bunch of eminent colleagues from around the world in exploring this question: how do we achieve eudaimonia? They formed this Values in Action Institute, an entity that persists today, and where I asked you to register to complete this assessment. They conducted this far-ranging study of cultures, philosophies, and religions in order to identify universal paths to eudaimonia. Seligman's goal was to create what he called a manual of the sanities, the counterpart to the diagnostic and statistical manual, which tells us so much about how to characterize and categorize and hopefully cure aspects of mental illness, to provide us with a much more a clear path to mental well-being and eudaimonia. The classification scheme, provided the sort of 6 overarching virtues that needed to be broken down into 24 strengths. Here are these universal virtues, and the asterisk simply indicates that there's some very small human subcultures in which not all 6 of these are equally valued, and yet by and large we can say all 6 of these are valued by human cultures, religions, spiritual and philosophical traditions. Wisdom, cognitive skills that allow us to process information effectively. Courage, emotional skills that allow us to pursue goals in the face of adversity. Humanity, interpersonal skills that allow us to tend to and befriend others. Justice, civic skills that allow us to live together effectively in community. Temperance, which are intrapersonal skills that allow us to exercise, in Seligman's phrase, judicious restraint. And finally, transcendence, skills that allow us to connect with something larger than ourselves. Now, these are valued in almost all cultures and traditions, but a dilemma that they have is that they're too abstract to test reliably. They can't be distilled down into an instrument. That's important because the positive psychologists were social scientists, and they wanted to craft an instrument that would allow us to develop a reliable test for our relationship with each of these 24 strengths. And that brings us to the items in your VIA report. So important to understand what these are. They are a path to a virtue, a process that defines a virtue, or a means by which a virtue is enacted, and equally important to understand what they're not. This instrument says nothing about your innate ability in any of these areas, or your capacity to develop these skills, or your aptitude or your proficiency. All it's saying is with regard to items in the report up at the top, you tend to experience a sense of ownership, celebration, and frequency of use. And as a consequence, they are likely sources of meaning and purpose for you as an individual. Now, as always, I'm going to remind you whenever encountering not only the assessments that we're exploring in this course, but any social science research, to bear in mind the map is not the territory. You know yourself, and I don't want you to feel kicked around by an instrument that might be presenting you with a portrait of yourself or a vision of yourself that you find that you disagree with. That said, if you find it disconfirming or surprising in some ways, I would invite you to get curious. Say, what is this about? What does this mean? And specifically, a dilemma that comes up with regard to this instrument is that people can sometimes get quite triggered where they see good things at the bottom. And just bear in mind, all 24 of these items are good things. They're all demonstrated paths to a sense of well-being, fulfillment, and meaning in life. And it's probably unlikely that you're going to be sort of equally committed to, equally adept at all 24. That seems like a tall order and an unhelpful way to sort of pursue, if we go back to the class on change, focusing and kind of narrowing areas that you really want to develop and pursue and become more effective at, likely to be more effective. So that brings us to this idea of signature strengths. What's up at the top? Well, Sullivan, here's his framework. The items that we feel are characterized by a sense of ownership and authenticity, an interest in continuing to learn about them, feelings of excitement and invigoration, and a desire to employ them more likely. These are likely to be our signature strengths. So with that, I want to tee up another conversation, after which I'll return to questions that you'll undoubtedly have about this body of material. My prep that I ask you to be ready for in this class, part 3, is what items are your signature strengths? And again, I want you to allow your results from the VIA to inform and not dictate. It's very important that you feel a sense of agency and choice. And how are they reliable paths to meaning for you? And if you see any, and do you see any missed opportunities, any ways in which you might actually leverage these signature strengths and double down on them a bit more effectively? So once again, you are going to have 16 minutes with your partner to explore these questions with each other. Which items are your signature strengths? How are they reliable paths to meaning for you? I'll see you back here in 16 minutes, and we'll have ample time to explore your questions. right, everybody, welcome back. I hope you had another fruitful conversation with your partner. And now I am going to take a few minutes. Let me just remind you, I hope you will make the effort to thank your partner and express some appreciation to them, whether this is somebody that you're living with and in active contact with, or if it's somebody that you're only in intermittent touch with for this class, that you'll express some appreciation to them for the learning that you're enjoying together. Now, let me take a few minutes and respond to your questions. What I'm going to do is stop the screen share again, and hopefully I will remember to initiate it. So a couple of questions, also going back to the last segment on why the focus on strengths. And let me tie back to a point I made, which I will return to in our class on success. We are absolutely capable of change. And so you may feel like there's a lot to be gained by skilling up in certain areas. It's very much a theme in my practice when I'm working with people earlier in their careers. It's very much a theme in my teaching, working with MBA students who often go to business school for the express purpose of skilling themselves up in certain areas. And a theme that we'll touch on in our class on success in a couple of weeks from the work of Peter Drucker, the sort of eminent management thinker from the 20th century, is that we need to pay attention to the opportunity cost. Even though we remain capable of change, and neuroscience research over the last few decades reinforces this. It isn't merely a nostrum. We have to understand, in investing the time and effort and energy that's going to take to skill myself up, what's the expected return on those investments? And in lots of areas, I would suggest, and this is not research driven, this is essentially me on a soapbox, drawing on a lot of conversations with many leaders and people in my practice over the years. We enter a transitional phase in our lives where continued investment and effort in skilling up areas of weakness is going to yield a much lower return than truly emphasizing and doubling down on our strengths. One way this manifests itself a lot with leaders in my practice is the importance of hiring complementary figures. For a leader to say, hey, I'm going to be the best and the most expert at all of these organizational disciplines, that's unlikely to be successful, or it's only going to be successful up to a certain point. And beyond that point, the organization is going to suffer. So the leader has to be able to bring in people who are going to have greater, who are going to be more expert, going to be stronger in certain disciplines. And the leader has to figure out, hey, how do I add value? Not on the basis of my continued deepening expertise, but on my ability to lead and manage somebody who's stronger in a given discipline than I am. I mean, that's a manifestation that I see in my practice, but I would say it applies more broadly in our lives in lots of ways. So I'm not saying, hey, stop worrying about skilling up or don't pay attention to your weaknesses. I am saying put this in the context of the sort of the arc of your career. Certainly the people who I work with in business school, what I see over many years in that work and assert to students is, at this stage when you've reached a certain degree of professional accomplishment, certainly with folks like that who tend to be in their late 20s, you may well be entering a phase or maybe deeply into that transitional phase where continued emphasis on skilling up your weaknesses is not going to be as fruitful. It's not going to yield sufficient. It's not going to yield equivalent results to focusing on your strengths. That's, again, I don't want that to be overinterpreted. It's up to you to really be quite discerning and understand, well, what does that mean for me as an individual? Questions about the extent to which our strengths change over time, and as measured by the VAA, the Values and Action Survey of Character Strengths that we just explored. Absolutely. I mean, this assessment is not one of those assessments that claiming to take a sort of a snapshot of your sort of everlasting soul. And to the extent that you encounter instruments that do claim to do that, I would view them somewhat skeptically with a grain of salt. Now, we do look for reliability in assessments like this. We want to see similar results over time, and yet, very much the case for the VIA, the results are quite contextual. Just speaking from personal experience, I began taking the VIA, and I take it every few years. About 12 years ago, I was in my late 30s, approaching 40, and gratitude was relatively low. I took a lot of things for granted. And over subsequent years, and candidly, because I've lost a number of people who are important to me, I stopped taking things for granted. I began to appreciate many more things that I enjoy about life. And so gratitude now is right up there near the top, and it stays up there reliably whenever I take it. So you should absolutely expect your results to change over time and to be quite contextual. A related question is, what related to the idea of contextuality, how do I pursue happiness in a virtual environment while sheltering under place? And I don't want anything that I'm talking about this week to be, understood as like, well, here's the magical solution to becoming happy in the midst of a global pandemic. That's not going to happen. We are fighting biology in all sorts of ways while we're sheltering in place because, meaningful social contact, it's a biological need. We are wired for that. There's a practice among primates, actually all mammals engage in it in one way or another, called social grooming. But we literally see it in most mammals where they're literally grooming each other. And it's not only a form of like removing parasites, but it's a form of creating a sense of trust, connectedness, and well-being. Now, humans don't literally, groom each other except under very rare circumstances, but we engage in a lot of social grooming activities, which, take the form of, small talk and laughing and engaging with each other and that almost always depends on physical proximity, and touch can be a very important part of that. Most of that is denied to us while we're operating in a virtual environment. So we are fighting biology. There's a reason why solitary confinement is considered an extreme form of punishment, and in some cases, active torture. And it's up to us, if we go back to the importance of small-scale intentional activities. During this period of extended confinement, how can we be more deliberate about engaging consistently and reliably in activities that may likely have a positive impact on our well-being, while other sources of well-being are denied to us. I'm not suggesting that any of this is going to be a panacea for that, but I do believe it can help. And in that process, I would again refer you back to our class on change and the idea of how to invest consistently in habits, practices, routines that we know are going to be useful to us, and which we sort of tend not to under ordinary circumstances. Well, these days it's harder, but I would suggest it's even more important. You take one question about which goes back to last week's the last segment, how to avoid overthinking and social comparison. And more specifically, I would refer you back to the class on attention. Overthinking is often the result of a kind of obsessive rumination. Our attention is being captured by something. Again, bear in mind, emotions are attention magnets. And so practices that support emotion regulation and practices that help us understand where is my attention going and can I regulate that more effectively would be very helpful with regard to overthinking. Social comparison, that's a topic that we're going to talk about more explicitly in our class on success in 3 weeks. And note that we're wired for social comparison. It's something that is very difficult to resist for a reason. And I will I won't say just like wait for 3 weeks. Feel free to look ahead at that material, but some of that material will be quite helpful in that regard. Okay, I want to push on to ensure that I keep my promise and my commitment to stay on time. And I want to provide you with a few thoughts for next week. So let me go back to sharing the slides. And once I can advance them successfully, say a few words to sort of sum up here. So, what we know from the research is that happiness matters. Our sense of well-being, and not merely in the sense of superficial pleasure, not really, hedonic well-being, but eudaimonic well-being, is associated with all sorts of positive life outcomes. And so if we can positively influence our sense of well-being through intentional activities, we may enjoy a number of positive life outcomes as a result. Now, we won't just be happier. We may also live more fulfilling, richer, more meaningful lives. And it's in pursuing these intentional activities, really important to understand our intrinsic motivation. Simply pursuing them out of a sense of obligation, out of guilt, is unlikely to yield sustained results. We might engage in them for a few days or even a few months, but we tend to drop off we fall off the wagon. Now, in this context, it's not enough just to kind of feel better. We're also being, I think, advised by this research to understand, where do I derive meaning? Where do I experience a sense of purpose and signature strengths? You know, the results of your VIA and the items that you truly identify with, they may be particular paths to eudaimonia. So to that sense of fulfillment and flourishing. So if you can see opportunities to be more deliberate about pursuing these paths in your life, some of which may involve making larger scale changes in your life circumstances, but that need not be the case, simply because we know that intentional activities can have a more significant impact even in the short run. So let me provide a few tips for next time and our upcoming class on resilience and vulnerability, where we take two topics and try to address them in a brief amount of time. There are 3 exercises that I'd like you to prepare for next week. First is the last instrument from social psychology that we'll be exploring, the resilience quotient. It's an instrument that has 56 questions drawn on the work of 2 psychologists who at the time of this work were at the University of Pennsylvania, really the kind of the founding center of positive psychology. Karen Revich, who is still at Penn, and her colleague Andrew Chate. My advice, as with all of these instruments, is to go with your gut, answer them quickly. Do not deliberate over what the right answer is, or the results will be less useful to you. Do it before the reading from Revich and Chate, because the instrument is also discussed in the reading. You'll get more value out of it if you complete the assessment, which will take about 10 minutes, and then score it, and then do the reading. There's also a worksheet after you've completed the reading and the assessment. I'd like you to fill out this worksheet. It'll prepare you for a discussion with your partner by asking you to take some brief notes and focus and reflect in a couple of specific ways. And then I want you to be prepared to tell a story. So these are a story that involves some experiences that have evoked feelings of vulnerability for you, and that can range from mild embarrassment to a sense of shame. The worksheet on the website will encourage you to identify 5 stories. It's up to you to choose which one, but I want you to give yourself a range of options in that exercise. Thank you. Today's slides are already up on my site. The video will be posted there later this afternoon. The readings for Class 6 are already there, and you can expect a weekly announcement from me with any further specific details, any special prep for our next class. That announcement will come out on Thursday the 7th, as well as the link to the next webinar. It is 11:30. I've got my promise to end on time. I also just want to express my appreciation to you for being here. A number of you have reached out and expressed your appreciation to me for offering this class, and I wanted to tell you that I'm getting as much out of the opportunity to be here as you may be getting out of it. So I'm really humbled by that appreciation, and I thank you. So I hope you have a good rest of the weekend. I hope you're able to stay safe and well, and I will look forward to being in touch with you again and seeing you next Saturday.